We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Vav Amid Beis in Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 56b. On the previous Talmud, the Gemara brought a brisa that's dealing with an animal that is a bechor, a firstborn animal, which is achazu dam, which essentially means it's critically ill. And the question is one allowed to let the blood of that animal, which will create a mum in that animal or not? And the brisa brings the first opinion, which is Rabbi Meir's opinion, that one is allowed to let the blood only in an area that does not create a mum. If it's in an area that's going to create a mum, that's problematic. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. The Chachamim say one is even allowed to let the blood in an area that will create a mum. You just can't slaughter the animal on the basis of that particular mum, on the basis of that particular blemish, a bechor that develops a blemish. You're allowed to slaughter it even outside of Yerushalayim. It's not considered sacred. It doesn't have that kedusha. And now Rabbi Shimon continues a third opinion, af nishchat al osomum, you can even slaughter that bechor on the basis of that blemish. Rashi on the previous Amud explained that Rabbi Shimon holds davar shein miskavin is mutter. There's no intention in this situation of creating the blemish in order to slaughter, and therefore it's mutter. And finally, a fourth opinion in the brisa, Rabbi Yehuda says, afilu meis, even if the animal will die, ein makizin lo es adam, one cannot let the blood. And Rashi explains what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, afilu yamus, even if it will die, im lo yakizenu, if without letting the blood it's going to die, ein makizin lo, one is not allowed to let the blood. But parakama de psachim, in the first parak of psachim, a farish time with Rabbi Yehuda, it explains what Rabbi Yehuda is saying. Rabbi Yehuda essentially is going to be the strictest of the opinions. He holds mitoch shadam bol al mamono, since a person is concerned about his money, isharis lei, if you're going to permit makom she'ein osin bo mum, we're not even going to permit a place where it's not going to create a blemish, because if we permit an area where it doesn't create a blemish, asi lemevad b'makom mum, then you're going to end up doing it in a place that does create a blemish. Over makom mum, svirle Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir da aser, and in a situation of a blemish, Rabbi Yehuda would agree with Rabbi Meir that it is aser, it is forbidden, and so therefore Rabbi Yehuda is strict in all situations. You cannot let the blood at all. And so the Gemara now continues and analyzes the brisa. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Hakol modim, everybody agrees b'mechametz achar mechametz, that one who leavens after it's already been leavened. This is talking about like by carbon mincha, which we were discussing earlier. By carbon mincha, you're not allowed to allow it to become chametz, and there can be various steps in the process of making the carbon mincha. Let's say it was already made chametz, and now we carry on with another step in the process, continuing to process that carbon mincha. So everybody agrees, shu chayiv, there's a liability, even though it was already chametz, but there can be liability for the further steps in the process. That everybody in this brisa agrees to that idea. Techsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, lo se'asa chametz, velo se'afe chametz, one is not allowed to make chametz, one can't bake chametz, and we learn that from this pasuk. Rashi explains, hakol modim, everybody agrees. Afagav de pligi b'matil mum achar mum, even though here we have a machlokas tanoim, by creating one blemish after really there already is a blemish, because this animal already is deathly ill. Kagon hacha, like over here, da achazu dam, it's seized by blood, it's in danger of its life. De ein lach mum gadol mizeh, there's no greater blemish than this. Sharei yamas, it's about to die. So even though there's a machlokas about whether one can make a blemish in this situation, mum achar mum, but afilu hachi, nevertheless, what the Gemara is saying, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, modim b'mechametz achar mechametz, they would agree by a case of chimutz. Let's say one person is doing a step in the process after it's already been made chametz, by menachos, kolomar means to say, kol hamisayin b'chimutz. The point is, anyone who's assisting in the process, in the leavening process, kagon orech achar halosh, like the one who shapes it after it's needed, v'yofa achar orech, and the one who bakes it after it's shaped, kulan chayavin, they are all going to be chayiv. And the Gemara continues again, everybody agrees by mechametz achar mechametz chayiv. And what about by mesares achar mesares? Also you have a case of mesares achar mesares, that refers to castration after castration, shu chayiv, there also there's liability. T'chsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, umoch v'chasus v'notuk v'karus, these are all different forms of crushing or squeezing the aver of the animal. Im al kores hu chayiv, if he's chayiv on kores, al notek lo kol shekein, certainly he should be chayiv on notek. If he is chayiv on cutting the testicles, certainly he should be chayiv on removing them entirely. And so why does the pasuk need to say both? Elo lohavi nosek achar kores shu chayiv, rather the pasuk is saying, even if he detaches it after it's been cut, still he's liable. And so therefore in both of these scenarios, again, there is liability, whether we're talking about mechametz achar mechametz or mesares achar mesares. Lo nechliku elo b'matel mum b'bal mum. The only machlokas is restricted to a situation of somebody who makes a blemish in an animal that has a blemish. And what is the machlokas? It's as follows. Rabbi Meir Savar, Rabbi Meir holds kol mum lo yabo, you can't make any blemish, and so therefore you'd only be allowed to let the blood in a fashion that it doesn't create a blemish. Rabbanon savri, but the Rabbanon hold tamim yeh l'ratzon. It says in the pasuk tamim yeh l'ratzon, and that means that only by an animal that's tamim is there a problem of inflicting a mum, but if there's already a mum, then it is not a problem. And Rashi explains, b'mesaris achar mesaris, again, one who castrates the animal after it's castrated, afilu bebehemes chulin, this is talking even by an animal that's chulin, not necessarily for a carbon. T'chsiv, as it's written, uva'artzechem lo sasu, don't do this in your land. V'im ba echad v'choras habeitzim, so let's say one comes and he cuts the beitzim, he cuts the testicles, v'yinichan tzluyin bekis, but they're still in the kiss, they're still hanging, uva'achar v'noskan lagamri, someone else comes and detaches them totally, chayev gamhu, he will also be chayev. Im al kores, and again it said that if for cutting it, shemanichan tzluyin v'yotzachayev, if you're chayev on cutting it, so al nosek lagamri lo kol shekain, certainly nosek, again, the pasuk means to say that nosek achar kores is chayev. Kol mum, and again the Gemara brought Rabbi Meir who brings the pasuk of kol mum, any blemish, and kol ribuyu, who kol is an inclusion. Umashma dafilu bebal mum lo yiten mamacher, according to Rabbi Meir, even if it already has a blemish, you can't make another blemish. V'rabbanon savri tamim yeh l'ratzon, but the Rabbanon hold tamim yeh l'ratzon, ksib b'reisha dekra, that's what it says in the beginning of the pasuk. Umashma hachi ososhu tamim v'roi lios l'ratzon, only the animal that is unblemished, that's able to be accepted. Ba'ahu mizhar nalach d'chol mum lo yabo, there's a warning of kol mum lo yabo. Aval bebal mum shari, but when it comes to a bal mum, it is in fact permitted. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Meir nami, but Rabbi Meir also, haksiv tamim yeh l'ratzon, isn't written in the pasuk tamim yeh l'ratzon, and so therefore he should agree with the Rabbanan, there's no problem if the animal is already blemished. But the Gemara says, no, ahula mu'ute bal mum meikara, that's coming to exclude, let's say it's a bal mum meikara from the outset, already when it was born it was a bal mum, so there we say there's no problem, but in this situation it would be problematic. But the Gemara says, bal mum meikara, what do you mean bal mum meikara? Dikla bi'alma, that's no different than an ordinary tree. Essentially, in that case, of course, it's obvious if it's born with a blemish, there would be no prohibition. Rashi explains, Dikla bi'almahu delo kadosh, it's not even going to have the holiness. Why would the pasuk even need to permit making a blemish in that situation? And so the Gemara instead continues and says, Elo rather, what does Rabbi Meir do with tamim yeh l'ratzon? L'me'ute psulei hamukdashim la'achar pidyonim. It's coming to exclude, let's say you have psulei hamukdashim, that means you have a carbon that becomes disqualified, and that disqualification was through a mum, it was through a blemish, and then the animal is redeemed. Now, even after redemption by psulei hamukdashim, there are still some restrictions, and so salkadai techamina, one might have thought, hoel va'asire begiza va'avoda, since such animals, psulei hamukdashim, la'achar pidyonim, still have certain prohibitions upon them, specifically the prohibition of shearing them and working them, so therefore one might have thought, b'mumam nami litzri, it's also usher to inflict a blemish on these animals. Kamash malon, that's what the pasuk is teaching us, tam yeh l'ratzon, that there is no prohibition of making a mum in this situation. And Rashi explains, hoel va'asire begiza, since these animals, psulei hamukdashim la'achar pidyonim, are forbidden to shear, kida'amrinon beperek beis tizbach v'lo giza, like it says in perek beis, you slaughter but you can't shear. Kamash malon is coming to teach us, the hoel v'niftu, since they have been redeemed, shari lahatel bomum, it is permitted to put a blemish on them, aval kodem pidyon aser, but before they're redeemed, it actually would be aser. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan nami, now the Rabbanan as well, haksiv kol mum lo yabo, isn't it written in the pasuk kol mum lo yabo? And again, Rabbi Meir uses that as an inclusion to say even if the animal has a blemish, the bechor has a blemish, you're not allowed to put another mum there. What do the Rabbanan do with kol mum lo yabo? And the Gemara says, Ahumi boy le'lechiratanya, that pasuk of kol mum lo yabo, according to the Rabbanan, is to teach us what is taught in the following brisa, v'chol mum lo yabo, it can't have any blemish, ein li elo shelo yehebo mum, I only know it can't have a blemish. Minayin shelo yigrom lo al yedei acherim. How do we know that he can't cause it through others? Meaning to say, how do we know that he cannot cause the mum indirectly? We understand he can't cause it directly. How do we know that indirectly is a problem? For example, shelo yaniach botzek o devel al gabe ha'ozen, that he shouldn't place dough or pressed figs upon the ear of the animal, kadesha yavo hakelav yitlenu, and that will cause the dog to come and take it, and therefore inflict a mum upon the ozen, upon the ear. How do we know that that is problematic? Talmud lomar kol mum, it says in the pasuk kol mum, again that's an inclusion. Amar mum v'yamar kol mum. It says mum and it says kol mum. And that comes to say that even indirectly is a problem. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Ami says, Hiniach Sa'or al Gabe Isa v'holach v'yoshav lo v'neschamtza me'eleh. If he places Sa'or, he places sourdough, a leavening agent, on top of the dough, and then he leaves, and then it becomes chametz on its own. Chayiv oleh kamaisa Shabbos. He's chayiv, just like we find by Shabbos. Rashi explains, Hiniach Sa'or al Gabe Isas Menachos. Again, this is talking about a carbon mincha. He places the Sa'or on the dough. V'yoshav lo v'neschamtza me'eleh chayiv b'hanacha b'alma. If he leaves, it becomes chametz on his own. He's chayiv through that hanacha because of that placement. Kemaisa Shabbos, just like Shabbos. Ki hechi demechayiv meniach basar al gecholim b'Shabbos. Just like, for example, a person puts meat on coals on Shabbos, v'nitzla me'elov, and then it roasts on its own. Chayiv, he's chayiv. So the same thing is true in this situation. And the Gemara continues, U'maisa Shabbos ki agavna mi mechayiv. Is Maisa Shabbos really chayiv in such a case? V'amar Rava bar bar Chana, but Rava bar bar Chana said, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph.